Welcome everyone to AURI Connect's Fields of Innovation, part of AURI Connect's monthly online series featuring updates on the work that AURI is doing to foster long-term economic benefit for Minnesota through value-added agricultural products and processes. I'm Dan Scogan, AURI's Director of Industry and Government Relations, and your host for Fields of Innovation. The AURI Connects program is hosted by the Agricultural Utilization Research Institute in Minnesota. Fields of Innovation is focused on bringing together Minnesota's regional ag and food value chains to build capacity and successfully commercialize new and emerging crops. Events focus on highlighting new crops, examining marketing opportunities for emerging crops, and highlighting new technologies in existing crops. Remember that this event is being recorded and archived and can be found at auri.org. Also remember, participants are muted, but you can ask your questions through our Q&A portal on your screen. Today, our program is called Solar Farm to Table. As we see more and more solar farms spring up, we have assembled a panel that will discuss the impacts for producers, energy users, and communities. Rob Davis will lead our panelists' discussion today. Rob is communications lead at Connexus Energy and is chair of the advisory committee to the National Renewable Energy Lab's INSPIRE study into low-impact and agriculturally innovative solar. Davis's work on pollinator-friendly solar has been featured in trainings by the U.S. Department of the Interior, the U.S. Department of Energy, and U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. In feature stories, he's been in Fast Company and Scientific American. And he has done a TED Talk called It's This Unlikely 1960s Space Tech Can Help Save the Bees. Previously, Davis had helped launch technology startups and created the international crowdsourced campaign that launched the Firefox web browser. Rob Davis and panelists, welcome to Fields of Innovation.
Dan, thank you so much, and everyone at AURI, thank you so much for hosting this timely and important conversation about what our future can look like. And Dan, I am so jealous of your profound radio voice. I will do my best to channel your baritone, but we'll have to work with the screechiness that is me. Really grateful for the conversation and the opportunity for the conversation today. You could just the folks that you'll hear from today include one of the nation's very largest solar farm grazers, one of the nation's largest solar farm beekeeping operators, and one of Minnesota's finest and the region's finest chefs that was profiled almost a year ago today in the New York Times. It's doing incredibly innovative things. So I look forward to introducing each of those presenters later on. I'm going to first present a little bit of context so that we can all kind of work and talk about this from the same page. So if you could go to the next slide, I think you'll understand that, like, you know, the sunniest places in America are where we started building this amazing, innovation called photovoltaic solar. It's a technology that doesn't get hot to the touch, it doesn't generate heat. It actually captures the sun's light and turns it directly into electricity. But because a lot of this development happened early on in the desert Southwest, the landscapes looked like this. Now, as the technology became better and better and cheaper, farmers throughout the Midwest and other areas of the country that have highly arable land grew concerned about thinking that there was something happening where the panels were affecting the vegetation or lack of vegetation under and around the panels. So if you go to the next slide, you can see that it is true that engineers and designers can design these solar projects to look differently, to have different features and have different ground cover types. Sometimes it's gravel, sometimes it's bare ground. And those aren't necessarily appropriate for a lot of communities or a lot of projects at scale. Go to the next slide, and you'll see how this is in use right here in the Midwest, in Iowa, where they trucked in tons and tons of class 5 gravel to go under and around the PV solar panels here. I can't imagine what happens with the stormwater on a site like this. It must, it's just a really difficult situation. But if you go to the next slide, then you'll see, like, of course, if we're talking about converting farmland into these barren energy landscapes, of course, that's going to cause tension. And so I think I, like everyone on the presenting today, and probably most folks joining the call today, are concerned with the productive use of farmland. We really want to celebrate community benefits, maximize community innovation, and enjoy this clean energy future without negative trade-offs. Next slide. So thankfully in Minnesota, we are an innovative place. And so I really tip my hat to agricultural innovators, Rod Hamilton and Senator Dan Sparks, that advanced a public policy in 2016 called the Pollinator-Friendly Solar Act, which has now been adopted and implemented in lots of other states around the country. And it encourages this practice of planting low-growing flowering meadows under and around solar farms. And the next slide. And so this idea of pollinator-friendly solar is not a restoration. It is not restoration of some pre-colonial condition. It's accepting that this solar project is happening and is looking for ways to provide meaningful benefits to the soil, to the pollinators, to the ecosystems within that managed context. So in the next slide. This is important because more and more crops, even today, are negatively depressed. The yields are depressed because of lack of insect pollinators. So these are the little insects that will move between flower and flower to ensure that the apples are even on both sides and help maximize those yields. Even soybeans benefit not just from wind pollination, but also from insect pollination. Next slide. And so this is obviously bumblebees provide these important functions as well as a wide variety of other pollinators. Next slide. And so this is what crops look like when they don't get enough insect pollination. And in the next slide, you'll see this is what they look like when they get sufficient pollination. So 2 to 3 visits per blueberry, 2 to 4 visits per apple, 5 to 6 visits per strawberry, 20 to 60 visits per raspberry. So the amount of insect pollination that needs to happen to maximize the yields of these crops is tremendous. And it's certainly not work that you or I or anyone on this call wants to be doing. We just need to keep the insects alive to let them do the hard work. In the next slide. So New York Times, Science Magazine, a variety of other scientists and media have highlighted this practice of pollinator-friendly solar about doubling and making a pollinator-friendly or planet-friendly energy source even more friendly. Next slide. And so these projects like this one at Connexus and next, and you can just clip through these after 2 seconds, all over with by NG and Aurora and Nell Green Power. These are all projects that are just beautiful flowering landscapes, again, growing under and around the panels on these solar farms. This one is up in Vermont. There's another one picture I've got here from a project down in Texas. This strategy is obviously fiercely limited by where plants can grow. So if plants can grow, we can do better than bare ground or turf grass. The scientists at the National Renewable Energy Lab, this is the study that was mentioned at the beginning, are advancing these practices of co-location of agriculture and ecosystem-friendly services to make sure that we're maximizing the benefits of this transition. So go ahead. And so the questions they're asking are really interesting. Can we, provide habitat for pollinators? Can we provide forage for sheep and forage for honeybees? Can we actually grow crops in the shade of some of these panels or in the full sun, either between the rows or just outside the fence where the crops can benefit from those ecosystem services? So the experts we have assembled today each have a different perspective on what is feasible and practical and what benefits their business, how they're embracing these new landscapes, because solar is really just another specialty crop. Even by the most ambitious planning and forecasting, they just forecast for something like 9 million acres of solar by 2050. So we have 90 million acres of corn in the United States today. And so solar was never going to supplant all the corn, never going to supplant all the soybeans, but it'll always have an opportunity to be a kind of a niche crop for value-added producers to innovate on top of. And next slide. So it's my pleasure to introduce Jake Jansky of Minnesota Native Landscapes. Jake is the Senior Ecologist and Director of Field Services as MNL's largest tenured employee. He's just a fantastic and invaluable research resource in advancing research and best practices. And I've seen Jake and his work and his team in action, and they are fantastic. Jake, take it away.
All right. Well, thank you for that, Rob. Appreciate it. Appreciate the kind words. And thank you, everyone, for joining us. It's really exciting to be here to kind of share some of MNL's story with you, let you know what we've been doing out on the landscape in relation to the pollinator-friendly solar and how we've been applying grazing and other ecosystem services to these sites to really maximize the benefits both to the landscape and to the local communities. MNL is a private ecological services provider. We are formally known as Minnesota Native Landscapes. So if you're not yet recognizing our new name and logo, that's probably why. We have been providing ecological services for over 25 years throughout the state of Minnesota and the upper Midwest. And we've really taken it to the next level over the last 5 years by incorporating a grazing program into our ecosystem management services. The most successful application of that we found for our grazing program is the use of sheep on these pollinator-friendly solar sites throughout the state of Minnesota. Next slide. So just to put this in a little bit of context for you, kind of where we're coming from our experience, here's just a quick rundown of some statistics of our grazing program from the last year. We've been on over 50 solar sites throughout the state, impacting well over 1,500 acres of pollinator-friendly solar. We are participating in 9 different study sites that I'll get into a little bit later in the presentation here. We're working with 8 different individual unique solar companies on their individual portfolios to implement our grazing program. But we're also supporting, at the time, 4 local farmers, local sheep producers around the state that we work with as collaborators to provide access to the forage on our grazing sites while applying our vegetation management standards to enhance the pollinator habitat. We have a small year-round staff. We ramp up in the summer, but we do currently overwinter all of our animals here in Minnesota. So there are some definite challenges to the program. It's been very well accepted in the solar industry, but it is also a very burgeoning market that is has a lot of growing to do. And I guess I'll just put a plug out there right now. You know, we're always looking for willing collaborators around the state of Minnesota who want to help us achieve our mission out there. We are also always looking for good employees to help us actually implement this work, because it's very complex. It takes the right mindset and the right people to make this stuff happen. And it's not easy, but the rewards are very, there's a lot of rewards out there, and it's a very rewarding work, I guess. I think in the chat box, there is our contact info, our website. But if you're interested in joining our team on any level, you can just shoot us an email, graze@mnlcorp.com, and get in touch with us. Let us know if you want to play a role in this. I promise that's the last plug I'll make. Next slide. So as Rob stated, there is, you know, a pollinator-friendly habitat standard for solar facilities in Minnesota, and we play a lot of different roles in that whole process. We try as a company to get involved as early on in the planning phase of this new development to help really lay the groundwork for success. And we found that the earlier we can be involved in helping these developers come to local communities and think through all the potential pitfalls and struggles they might have and help mitigate that up front, that the projects at the end of the day are far more successful. They're far less costly in the long run to manage, and they have a better relationship with the communities that they're moving these farms into because they do have a plan, and the locals can see that the plan is being properly implemented. It's not all a bunch of promises and excuses to get your permit, and then there's no action at the end of it. We're really committed to not just getting the vegetation established, but having it be a quality plant community, and serving the long-term ecological purposes of a native plant community. But there's a lot to it. Setting up the plan in advance, understanding all the standards that we're trying to achieve, whether it be with the local permitting authorities, the state, understanding the operational requirements of a power plant. The plant communities we're restoring on these solar sites is very different than what we would do in like a scientific and natural area or a CRP. These are functional power plants, and we have to adapt what we're doing to meet the needs of energy production as well. So it's a fine line that we try to walk to make sure that we're kind of ticking all the boxes and meeting everyone's need. The seed mix design speaks to that. I'll talk about that in a minute here, how we apply those different inputs to design a mix that's most applicable to what our goals are. But then we take it all the way through the seeding plan, dealing with the erosion control during the establishment. And then the long term is really the establishment plans. How do we, again, facilitate the establishment of pollinator-friendly habitats on operational power plants? So we really look at both the short-term establishment period and the long-term maintenance period. And in doing so, we look at the whole toolbox of ecological services that a company like ours can provide. Next slide. So just to touch a little bit more on the seed mixes, this plays a huge role in both the initial permitting, the initial vegetation establishment, but also how we apply our vegetation management practices to the project site. Because there's a vast difference in creating a project that is trying to meet habitat standards versus, say, a pasture that's just designed to feed animals. And in this context, dealing with these quite complex ecosystems, we're trying to use the best tools possible. And on solar sites, there are some limitations to the tools that we have available that we would maybe be able to apply in other sort of ecosystem restoration work, such as prescribed fire as an example. Knowing some of those tools were not available in our toolbox for this, that's when we really decided to implement the grazing program on these sites as a management tool. Next slide. So, the idea and the choice to use sheep grazing for vegetation management, it provides numerous benefits other than just what a mower would do. Oftentimes there's this false comparison of sheep grazing to mowing, and it's just, they don't accomplish the same things. Sheep grazing can accomplish a lot of the things mowing does, but the amount of added benefits they can provide to both the land and the community are far different and far greater than what mowing does. Sheep are incredibly good at both vegetation height and density reduction, and that's a big concern on these plants. Technicians are out working on the sites all the time, doing repairs, needing to access the panels, and a lot of times pollinator-friendly vegetation can be quite robust, I guess I would say. So the animals do a really good job at this, at reducing that and allowing for access to the equipment. Sheep grazing also has a much lower risk of damage to equipment, infractions, than mowing, tractors, heavy equipment along all this glass might have. But one of the biggest benefits that sheep do is actually wildfire risk mitigation. I'm sure, with the year we've been having, wildfires are very top of the mind to a lot of people. And pollinator friendly vegetation does produce a lot of thatch, and that will accumulate over time, as we know in native prairie systems. Normally in a prairie system, we'd be able to do a prescribed burn to clear away that thatch and reinvigorate the native plants. Not having that option on the solar sites kind of forced us to find other ways to create that disturbance regimen that most native plantings, native ecosystems have adapted with. So we found it very productive to use a high intensity mob grazing of our sheep to not only reduce the vegetation height, but also to break up and remove the thatch at the ground level. And the goal of this is to really reduce the intensity of a fire if one were to start. Obviously nothing's 100% foolproof, but it has proven to be a very effective way to, again, control that thatch layer and to also invigorate native green growth. So there are multiple benefits that we found in the program, but there are also a lot of questions. What are the animals doing to the habitat? Next slide. So what we've done is start to develop a few research opportunities to really study the impacts that the animals are having to the habitat diversity and the plant community as a whole. We work under the assumption that it's beneficial. You know, prairies co-evolved with herds of bison. Grazing and native plants are not, this isn't a new concept. But to the specific level of meeting pollinator standards, there are still some questions. So there are a few different research opportunities we've been involved in. We're looking at soil research with Temple University, comparing our grazing plots to non-grazing control plots. Rob alluded to the Inspire project that we're working on with NREL, so I won't get into that. But I did really quickly want to touch on a Minnesota Department of Agriculture study that we're doing under the AURI program, Sustainable Agriculture Demonstration Grant. It is a program or a grant that M&L applied for, and we're in the midst of a 3-year study on the species density and diversity in grazed ecosystems. Next slide. So real briefly, we have identified 6 study sites, all of which were established as pollinator-friendly solar, all of which have grazing as the primary vegetation management tool, and all of which have established control plots within them that are not being grazed, that are being, the sheep are excluded from during the graze deployments. And what we're doing is 3 times a year doing transect surveys of vegetation density and species diversity. So far, we're only on the 2nd year of our study, and we're still compiling the data. We're just starting to see results, some changes in species composition. I would expect this will take 5 to 10 years to really have some concrete information on what those changes are, but it's just one example of something we're actively pursuing to really learn what the long-term ecological impacts are of our work. We've established pretty well that the functional results of grazing are what we are looking for, but trying to get a little more data and see how it's affecting the habitat, especially as it applies to our habitat standards. So stay tuned to this. We do publish this annually in the MDA's Green Book, our results. So that will be available early in 2021 or 22, sorry. Next slide. I think we just have a few photos of our study plots that we've excluded, just to give you a feel for kind of what the short-term impacts are of our grazing efforts. Next slide. But what we're really hoping to learn, at least from this study, is what the pollinator habitat effects are over the long term. And I think with that, I am done. Thank you very much. Next slide. And again, here's our contact info. One of our little employees, very hard worker. Like I said, please get in contact with us if you're interested in becoming part of the team or joining our efforts. So with that, turn it back over to Rob.
Thank you so much, Jake. And if there is anyone on this call who can eat 20 pounds of grass a day continuously for the next several months, please do get in touch with Jake or Yeah, there's lots of opportunities in this space. So we're so excited to share this with you all. Grazing is one exciting practice about how to make productive use of the land under and around solar panels. And you might think that it is incompatible with pollinators. That is actually, not the case. As Jake alluded to, there is more and more research showing that actually breaking up of that compacted matter and the hoofs and the trampling action of the sheep actually increase biodiversity. And so it's actually good for creating a high quality, diverse pollinator habitat, which actually brings us to another kind of managed livestock, which is the tiny little honeybees. And so it's my pleasure to introduce the nation's largest solar beekeeping operator, Dustin Vanasse, the CEO and founder of Solar-Based Beekeeping and Bear Honey. Dustin.
Thanks, Rob, and thank you everybody for coming to our panel today. I'll probably say a lot of the similar things that Jake just mentioned, and I hope won't go over them too much in detail. But anyway, like Rob said, my name is Dustin Vanasse. My company is called Bear Honey. We've been working with Rob in his role as the director of the Center for Pollinators and Energy for the last 4 years. And then we're going into our 5th beekeeping season on solar now, where coming in 2022, we'll have almost 100% of our hives on solar. It's taken us kind of baby steps to work our way in. We also work with another network of beekeepers and subcontract for their placement of hives on solar farms. This is how we're developing our expansion into the solar realm. So next slide. That's just an old picture. You probably, it looks better than me today. I've been suffering a head cold all week, so apologize if I have to mute to cough. There we go. So one of the things that Rob had mentioned is a pollinator scorecard. And what the pollinator scorecard is, it's been developed by the University of Minnesota and Rob Davis and other ecologists to rate the quality of pollinator habitat on the solar arrays. One of the things that we've been able to do with this pollinator scorecard is that it can provide the seed mixes that are going to be used on the solar arrays. This is entirely useful for us because this gives us a predictive ability of what is going to be blooming throughout the year. As beekeepers, we're in tune with what is going to be providing our bees with pollen forage or nectar forage throughout the year, and what blooms depending cyclically throughout the summer. So this gives us a little bit of predictability on what is going to be happening. It also indicates what the percentage of native species are on the site. This is entirely useful to us because young bees are entirely reliant on pollen for their diets. Pollen is what the adult bees bring into the hives, the sometimes yellow powder, sometimes it's black, sometimes it's pink, sometimes it's green. We get all different colors of pollen that from different types of trees and flowers. But this is what is fed to the young bees. And it's important that the bees have a cyclically blooming cycle of pollen because as they have a much healthier diet, you can think of if they were on let's say like a cornfield and they, had 40, 50 acres of corn all surrounding them. And the only thing they could eat was corn. This would be akin to you eating, let's say, cornbread, for every meal, every day, all for the entire bloom season. That's not exactly a healthy diet for you or for our young bees. And so these sites have many diverse pollens that are available to our bees. This creates a higher population within our hives, which then provides for larger foraging populations. But there's a diversity of species here also. So oftentimes, especially when they're planting for sheep grazers in mind, there's legumes that are planted with them. These legumes are often great sources of nectar for our adult bees, and the larger hive populations that have been established in the hives due to the abundance of pollens are then translated into larger honey crops because there's more bees to go out and forage these nectar sources and bring them in. This year, in fact, our co-located sites that are with sheep grazers as well have outperformed our non-solar sites by up to 50% yield. So in a drought year like we're having right now, having this diversity of species on the site is essential to us maintaining our yields. As I mentioned throughout the conversation, the word cyclically blooming. Just what that means is that there's a cycle of flowers throughout the year, right? So the willow starts in the early season with trees. Then we move on to different flowers throughout the year till we get to finally the goldenrod that's blooming right now. And cyclically blooming means that throughout the entire season that there's a stage by stage by stage diversity of flowers that are in bloom all the time that are providing that food source for us. And that is very, very much important when we're managing bees, because the bees are while they have different cycles throughout the year of when the nectar flow is on, one thing that's common throughout the year is that they need healthy pollen sources from spring to summer into the fall as well. I'll talk a little bit about nearby assets. So some of the solar arrays are located fairly far apart from each other, and some of them are located in small vicinities, which are only a 2-minute drive from each other. So nearby assets in this regard, we talk about how that if a site is located more than 25 minutes away from the next site that you need to get to pollinator-friendly solar, that oftentimes is not very profitable to operate on those sites because you spend as much time traveling between the sites as you do actually on the site working the bees. And we're always looking for sites that have space to operate. While our beehives themselves are on pallets that are 4 foot by 4 foot and doesn't take up very much space, we also are bringing in large equipment, so trailers and skid steers, and we need room to turn around. We need large, flat, level ground that we can place hives on. If you place hives on a hill or an angle, they're not going to produce honey, and they're probably going to leave the hive or swarm because it's not an ideal place for them to locate themselves. Signage. So many of these solar sites are located on fairly busy, well-visible roads, and this is one opportunity that I see missed most often by companies. I can tell you firsthand experience that our customers, our corporate and store buyers all have found added value in the solar grown label. Agrivoltaics, well, it's in its nascent stages today. We're just talking about it. And we're just getting it going and spreading it into the market, is an opportunity for companies to align themselves with consumer values. These sites are not only providing forage for honeybees and sheep grazers, but they're also providing habitat for upland game birds and other wildlife, and these are the connections that can provide a company with opportunities to connect with their consumers that are conservationally minded, environmentally minded, or even sport hunters and wildlife lovers. It branches across the political spectrum, and these sites provide that opportunity to connect. Management plans are important to talk about as well. This is something that with MNL or the other vegetation management companies is important that we have communication with, because well, we talked about grazing today. Some sites are managed by mowing, and sites that are managed by mowing, oftentimes, let's have an example of the first week of August, the yellow sow thistle will be coming up oftentimes, and this is a plant that can provide pollen for our bees during that several week period. If that gets mowed down, then our bees have a loss of forageability. So we need to be able to have that communication with the management plan on the site in order to supplement our hives with feed and offset the loss of forage at those times if needed. But one of the best outcomes of the pollinator-friendly solar sites is the lack of insecticide use or pesticide uses on the sites. We live in a world that is dominated by industrialized agriculture, and it's essentially if you're an agricultural operator, you look at a lot of these lands and they are large industrial zones that are oftentimes hostile to our insects and our bees and our native pollinators as well. These pollinator-friendly solar sites are truly an oasis from that industrialized agriculture and provides, small steps towards how we can preserve our native and honeybees alike. Next slide. So a little bit about solar grown. So solar grown is a trademark that's owned by the Center for Pollinators and Energy, and it's a specialty crop that we have been developing over the last 4 years. And what it essentially is that this is a certification that's the products, in our case, honey, solar grown honey, is coming from the sites that are planted for pollinator friendly habitat. This is something that's exciting that I know that Rob had mentioned, that's, a raspberry takes up to, 12 to 30 visits by a single bee to make that raspberry, or, an apple, 5 visits by a single bee. We envision a future where inside the fence, there's sheep grazing going on. Outside the fence, we have our hives. And then further outside surrounding the area, we can plant pollinator friendly crops. So things like the apples, the blueberries, the strawberries, the raspberries, and other pollinator dependent crops that are going to be reliant on these. And while we can maximize our yields because of these oases and the pollen that's provided by them, then other pollinator dependent farmers can maximize their yields also by our presence there with our honeybees. Next slide. We've had a great opportunity to not only, spread this message on our own, but working with much larger companies as well. I always say that, when we shout as a small company, it comes across as a whisper. But when a large company like Cliff Bar, or in this case, their subsidiary Cliff Family Winery, comes out with a product and whispers about it, it's a shout to the market. One of the other things that we also have done is we work with several breweries across the country to provide this as a hero ingredient. Solar grown is a hero ingredient. And as I mentioned before, the way that solar companies can connect with their consumers' values, we're also connected with our consumer values by promoting the idea of what solar grown is and what agrivoltaics is. Next slide. This spring has been really, really exciting for us, and then we were down in Florida. We overwinter some hives in Florida, and working with Disney and a brewery called First Magnitude Brewing, we came out with the honey citrus blonde ale, which was debuted at the Epcot flower show this spring, which was an amazing opportunity. And working with larger companies again like Disney or Cliff Bar is a way that we're going to move this movement forward, and we can bring the marketing opportunity and the messaging that's behind the agrivoltaics to the general public. Next slide. So thank you very much for listening to us today, and I will give it back to Rob.
Thanks so much, Dustin. Very much exciting times indeed, and Bear Honey has just been a really thoughtful, intentional, exciting, innovative company to partner with in understanding these new opportunities with these new landscapes, and a delicious partner as well. My favorite way to drink honey is when it's an ingredient in beer. So next slide. It's important, I think, to have some additional context about different solar designs. And the reality today is that there's a variety of ways to build solar cheap, and there's a variety of ways to build it very expensive. And then obviously there's a huge range in between. And so, if you get upset, if you see the future and you see a really amazing sports car drive by, and then you're like, oh wow, I'm gonna get a car. That's exciting. And then what you end up buying is a rundown, used vehicle, a Vega from 1972 or something. That's because you just asked for a car and a salesperson sold you a car. So the important thing, I think, for agricultural producers, and as well as cooperatives like Connexus, as well as electric utilities, is to express your preferences and ask for solar that includes some of these agricultural practices. If you ask for solar that includes pollinator-friendly ground cover, then that's exactly what the market will build for you. So it's really exciting to see great collaborations. I know companies like US Solar and Nokomis Energy are building pollinator-friendly solar by default and increasingly doing more and more grazing on those projects. Sunshare and Enel are doing a lot of pollinator-friendly solar as well as grazing. And then also in the co-op world, My Energy Cooperative and One Energy Renewables have a really exciting project in partnership with Featherstone Farms, where they're actually going to be growing crops. And that's because Featherstone happened to be right there. And the same thing happened with Sunshare, where they struck up an agreement with the folks at Tangletown Gardens and some farmers and decided that the farmer was going to use his land not just for solar, but also to co-locate some vegetable and produce production. But it's important to keep in context that higher solar panels can have a significant cost. So particularly once the panels get above person height. When the panels are between the lower edges between your knee and your waist, that is easy for a construction worker to pick the panels up, to put them down, screw them in. But when they are like this project, pictured in Massachusetts, Massachusetts really doesn't have much farmland like Minnesota does. So they're very farmland constrained, and they have a policy that encourages higher solar panels. But the higher solar panels increase the cost of the labor as well as the steel. So that's important to kind of keep in context with regards to how to do solar in a cost-effective way so that it can still shut down coal-fired power plants and other fossil fuel plants to help us mitigate and fight the worst effects of climate change. Next slide. So as Dustin and Jake have mentioned, it is exciting more and more to think about the large solar arrays and solar farms. Connexus Energy, by default standard, always asks for pollinator-friendly solar. We're just delighted to have partnered with Novel Energy on our two most recent solar projects that have tracking panels here in our service territory. And then another one that actually is cultivating seeds, pollinator-dependent seeds that are being harvested under and around the panels. But certainly for crops and agriculture, a great opportunity is to consider and look at pollinator-dependent crops where the bees fly through the fence and visit and benefit the crops like these watermelons and tomatoes and squash. Next slide. And of course, when you have delicious ingredients, the best thing to do is to, of course, eat them. And who better to help you in that, noble pursuit than, one of Minnesota's most talented and extraordinary chefs. So it was fantastic to partner with Mateo McBee of Crew Restaurant and last year for an event we called the Solar Farm to Table Sampler. We had basil and chiltepin peppers from solar farms in Arizona, peaches and plums that are benefiting from the ecosystem services actually near Taylor's Falls, lamb from Minnesota and Minnesota Native Landscapes, or MNL, saffron from solar farms in Vermont, and a lot of potatoes and dried tomatoes from solar farms in Oregon, as well as some of Dustin's delicious honey that went into a beer. So that's a long way of introducing you to one of my favorite people in Minnesota, Mateo McBee of Crew Restaurant. Next slide. And Mateo was our chef for this wonderful dinner that we pulled together last year. Mateo, I'll turn it over to you.
All right, thanks, Rob. Hello to Dustin and Jake again. Good to see you both. And thank you all for having me here. This has been a wonderful experience working with all of these folks. And so it's we're excited for what the kind of future holds. So next slide. So we were kind of tasked with the idea of coming up with a sampler based off the ingredients. And so I was very surprised to see the amount of kind of agrivoltaic crops that are able to be grown in different places around the country. And so it was the best challenge you could ever think of, to get these wonderful products and then turn them into really awesome dishes. And so we did end up cooking everything in either open fire or over using induction stoves as well. And so we tried to keep everything together with the theme of being solar friendly and using electricity. And so we had some really cool, I haven't had a chance to work with a lot of pheasant before, so that was really awesome to be able to used some pheasant. The saffron was amazing. We braised some lamb and cooked some over wood fire, and I think that was probably the highlight towards the end of the night, being able to take a nice piece of roasted wood-fired lamb and some good honey-infused beer, and have that towards the end of the night was a pretty special moment. So next slide. So just got the idea. We are in St. Joseph, and Milk and Honey is probably about 1.5 miles to 2 miles away from us. So it was a really awesome collaboration between Milk and Honey ciders and crew to be able to come out. It was an awesome experience for our staff to be able to learn and be educated about agrivoltaics and solar powered energy as well. And so not only was it beneficial for myself and my partner Aaron to kind of come up with ideas and create menu items, but also for roughly about 15 of our staff members to be able to become even more educated on how it all works. So next slide. And so for us, we also, our restaurants are kind of founded around the idea of a nonprofit that we have called Model Citizen Inc. It is around bringing rural and urban youth together around farming practices, sustainability, entrepreneurship, and agriculture. And so this is a no-brainer for us to be able to partner with all of these folks here to do this wonderful sampler that we did, and also highlight the opportunities that I believe are available for our young kids to be able to learn this. For us at the middle school age is what we are targeting, to have them be able to get an experience in and around and see some of these projects in the works and possibly in development as well, to encourage them to kind of dream about what other things may be possible for agrivoltaics. Next slide. So here's some of the food that we had that night. Potatoes and carrots. The basil was some of the best basil I've ever tasted. And some of the research that we were doing around the amount of heat and diffusion that is happens around solar arrays, and for some of the vegetables, including herbs, that kind of suffer from some of the scorching heat that we've had even this summer. Even the stuff that we've grown on our own, you can tell that if a lot of the stuff was grown under solar arrays, that it may have turned out better than what we were able to grow now, because of the constant contact of the sun on these delicate leaves and vegetables. Next slide. So again, it was awesome to be able to work with everyone, and we look forward to doing the next one and doing more, and hopefully developing some projects, some educational projects around solar and agrivoltaics, that we're able to bring some students out to be able to see how it all works. So back to you, Rob.
Fantastic. Thank you all so much. It's been really so much fun to get to collaborate with you all, as well as all of your partners. And Dan, I think that we're ready for some questions with a few minutes to go here.
All right. Thank you very much, gentlemen, and great presentations by all of you. And we do have some questions, and I think everybody's going to get a chance to weigh in. I'd certainly encourage, if you have a thought on some of these questions, to share with our audience. But let's start right at the top. The first one that came in: can pollen affect the efficiency of the panels?
Yeah, that's a great question. That's a common question, I should say. And it's common because, unfortunately, a lot of this stuff hasn't been taught to us over time. So of course, pollen can. However, the reality is that it doesn't. So in order for the pollen to get off of the plant, the insect or the bee has to go to the flower and then shake it or vibrate or get up all in there, right? However, the different kind of plants, like, I don't know, corn, they release copious amounts of pollen all over everything. It's just everywhere. Corn pollen, holy cow. So if you're going to build solar and you're concerned about pollen, build solar where there's no corn within a mile or two. But certainly pollen from flowering plants is nothing to be concerned about.
Also, I was wondering, as you are beginning your presentation today, if a landowner has that desire to have multiple use, on this piece of property, do they need to write that into the contract in the front end, or is there an opportunity to enter into the add on to the agreement, I might say, at a later time?
I recommend to every landowner that if they want something to be able to have the option for it, that they should put it in the contract up front. So otherwise they have to go back and try to renegotiate and have a new deal when they have maybe little or no leverage. So I definitely encourage landowners to have those conversations up front. And it also is important to think, like, if they're going to lease out 100 acres or maybe 500 acres or more, maybe they just want a few acres to be able to, use, for crops, or maybe they want the whole project not to be mowed 3, 4, 5 times a year, but to actually be grazed. Or maybe they have some specialty agriculture on a different piece of their land, so they want honeybees. Landowners should just write that into the contract.
I think Jake and Dustin maybe both touched on it, but there's a question about, is there opportunities to grow other food crops around these solar sites, fruits, vegetables, for example? We saw some pictures, so apparently it is an opportunity. Are they right on that site, or are they on the perimeter?
So in that picture, the watermelon and the tomatoes and squash are grown about 20 feet back from the fence line. So basically right out of the area where the farmer has leased the land. And in fact, right here in Ramsey, Minnesota, Connexus Energy has a beautiful Ramsey Renewable station with some really big batteries. The neighboring farm is growing Minnesota grown watermelon and peppers, and his field is just alive with pollinators and is actually part of one of the research projects, including Inspire. So there's a variety of different pollinator dependent crops, and not just pollination. I should also say, the ladybugs that increase in abundance from a flowering solar farm, all of those ladybugs eat something like 5,000 aphids during their lifetime. So biocontrol of pests is a fantastic benefit that solar farms can provide to nearby agriculture.
Jake or Dustin, anything to add to that?
Yeah, I would just reinforce what Rob said. With the site that Connexus that we have bees on, he mentioned the watermelons and the pumpkins and whatnot. But we're also on sites that share borders with pumpkin patches and strawberry fields, and as well as peaches. I know that there's a peach and plum grower that does hoop house growing that benefits from our pollination as well. There's several farms that have adjacent land that is planted that is benefiting from pollination.
Jake, I see you're nodding in agreement. Is that?
Yeah, I would echo that. Solar adjacent land is probably optimal. Again, for the operational aspect of a power plant. When the facility needs work, the facility needs work. So just to ensure the integrity of your crops adjacent to that habitat and the bees, I think is optimal.
Let me ask a question about adjacent land. Are there any particular challenges to solar sites bee production and conventional egg practices that might be occurring on a neighboring field?
Can you repeat that question?
Are there any particular challenges to solar site bee production and conventional egg practices that might be occurring on a neighboring field?
So I would say that those are the same conflicts that we would have with if the site was not a solar site. So I can think of that there are appropriate solar sites for bees, and then there's inappropriate ones as well. An appropriate site is going to be a site that has buffers, that has plenty of forage available. And one of the things we look at as we're moving on to sites is the adjacent forage for the bees as well. Whereas an inappropriate site, I can think of, one that we took a survey of, and it was located in the middle of a large cropping field. So the only thing for this small site, I think it was a 3-acre site, for the bees to eat was on site, whereas for 100 acres surrounding in every direction, it was all corn or soybeans, depending on the year. And so there's those conflicts that are there in agriculture. Also, for conventional farms. They don't just disappear. But these sites, as we get more and more of them together and are in a similar area, they provide that oasis and that respite from the industrialized agriculture.
Well, Dustin, let me follow up with you then. If somebody's thinking about a bee site, what's the best practices buffer that you would like to see?
Every site is going to be a little bit different. It's hard to say, it involves years of keeping bees and finding appropriate site placements. It's not a simple, 30-second blip that I can give you what an excellent bee site could look like. But what we're looking for when we place hives on site, it's not necessarily amount of feet, but it's going to be, what types of blooms are available? Are there going to be linden or basswood trees that are available around the 4th of July? Like, what cyclical blooms are going to be on site with the seed mix? And how do those relate to the surrounding legume forage or the surrounding tree forage that the bees are going to have? What is the access to water, to clean water? Is there going to be runoff from pesticides on agricultural crops that are going to be nearby in nearby ditches? So as you can see, just from my brief explanation, it's much more complicated than what's an appropriate buffer.
Right. We did have a question around water. Is the proximity of water an issue for bees and honey?
So yeah, definitely. I mean, bees, just like every other animal, need water, and having approximate, close, clean water sources is essential for honeybee health. We don't, water our bees. We don't put a little, bath out or a feeding trough filled with water for bees. That's impractical. But we ensure that, when we choose sites, that there are water sources nearby that will be clean drinking sources for the bees during droughts, especially. But, also much of the water that the bees consume is simply from the nectar. So when you think of like what honey is, 18% water content or less, but it starts off as nectar, which is in the 90% water content. And so all that water from that nectar is what the bees are consuming and using as well.
And Jake, could you speak to that? And then I have a related sheep question for Mateo after Jake talks about water.
Perfect. Jake?
Well, yeah, and I would think that, or I would assume that a lot of those same patterns with the native pollinators, local water, clean, perennial water sources. It is one of the values on the pollinator scorecard, having perennial water in proximity. It is very beneficial to all the wildlife and the habitat we're creating. Pretty essential aspect to that. I will say it does not benefit the grazing operation because most of that is stagnant water that we don't allow the animals access to just because of disease and other possible parasitic impacts they might have on the animals. So that is kind of actually a no-no for the sheep, but generally good for the habitat in general.
Mateo, the question I had about sheep was, I was amazed at how much you broke down, sheep last year. How, we seem to have need more of that, more butchers, more sheep butchers in the United States. Jake's got a lot of delicious lamb if we have the butchers for it. How long does it take to break that down?
Absolutely. I was a little rusty doing it. It's been a little while since I've done it, but it's probably about a 30-minute time to break that down into the pieces that we had there from that whole animal that we got. But absolutely, most of those animals are ended up frozen for 6 months and shipped from the other side of the world most of the time. So I know there's a few people who are working on some processors in the area to kind of help, because there is an absolute demand, especially in the Midwest, for some really good sheep and lamb. Absolutely.
A participant would like to know if there's any work being done to explore other grazing animals, cattle, goats, other things that might work.
Go ahead,
Inspire
Rob.
study, the Inspire study is looking at cattle, but goats will jump up on the panels.
Yeah.
Not good.
Yeah, we've made a hard, very deliberate decision not to utilize goats. We have them, we use them on other sites for brush control and stuff, but yeah, the sheep like to stay on all four hooves while they eat. Goats like to be on 2 hooves when they eat. So we stick with the sheep, for the equipment aspect.
And cattle are too large?
They rub, yeah. And Dan, just in one parting shot, if we could pull the PowerPoint up again, I just have one last thing to share with folks that turned in and then stuck around till the end here today. It's that, go to the next slide. If folks go to and want to see more of this kind of idea of co-location of agriculture and solar in the world, they can go vote for Lego to actually produce a Lego solar farm that includes grazing and beekeeping. And it's just legosolarfarm.me. And we need 10,000 votes, and then Lego will make this, or will consider putting this kit into a real world product.
Very good. Dustin, are there particular types of native plants that make better honey?
Yeah, definitely. There's, well, you know, better is always perspective. You know, my favorite type of honey is goldenrod honey, which, you know, produces nectar when it's above 80 degrees. So this year we're actually starting to get some in. Some years, you know, it's hit and miss. But there's a lot of goldenrod planted on most of these sites. And so we're looking at having a pretty good fall with the goldenrod bloom.
Does the presence of a solar array affect soil moisture? They're thinking about.
I can speak to that. Okay. There's research that's been done in Oregon showing that actually the shading of the panels increases the production of grasses and the root structure of those grasses under and around them. So they actually have more nutrients in the plant for the grazing animals. And the researchers who did that, when I talked to them about worms, they were like, oh my gosh, yeah, in the shade of the panels, there were way bigger worms, but we didn't keep track of them. So there's definitely really interesting opportunities that happen with that shade structure and the benefits that it can provide for plants as well as grazing animals.
Mateo, don't leave us yet, because they're wondering if the ingredient taste and quality compared to what you would usually source.
I've found it to be more flavorful. I think the less stress that is on some of these plants, and then the kind of natural habitat that the animals are able to graze on versus kind of manufactured food lends to in both instances a more tastier product for sure. Back to livestock production. Any poultry, anybody working on any poultry production around a solar site, Jake or Rob?
We have not. I guess predators would be my number one concern, and then containment also, but they are a very integral part of our ecosystem. So that'll probably be the next phase of this. You know, egg mobiles out on solar sites, following up the sheep.
Go ahead, Rob.
I know that Will Harris down, regenerative farmer Will Harris is doing sheep as well as poultry down in northern Georgia on some solar farms for Facebook data centers. But I think he's got a pretty specialized operation up there or down there. So I don't know how easily replicable it is. But it would be interesting to see what Minnesota turkey growers could do. That, you know, we don't want turkeys roosting up on the panels though, because that could really soil the panels very quickly.
Mateo, do you have another sampler planned in the near future?
We're thinking about it.
Okay. And last question of the afternoon, gentlemen. How many acres of solar are in the state of Minnesota right now, or in the US, if you know that number?
Yeah, so in Minnesota today, there's more than 5,000 acres of solar. And in the US today, there's more than 350 or 400,000 acres. But again, we're scaling to 9 million acres by 2030. And that's really driven by the fact that when something is better and cheaper, people like it. People want more of it. But I think it really reiterates the importance of agricultural producers, towns, cities, and corporations asking for what they want. And so if they want just solar with bare ground, then just ask for solar. But if they want solar with regenerative practices, with grazing, with beekeeping, with delicious creations of Mateo's creation, put it in the contract, ask for it, put it in the RFP. There's enough competition and enough knowledgeable providers out there that you'll get some exciting responses to those inquiries.
Any other comments? All right. Thank you very much, gentlemen, for a great presentation today. That does conclude AURI Connect's Fields of Innovation for today, presented by the Agricultural Utilization Research Institute of Minnesota. AURI's mission is to foster long-term economic benefit for Minnesota through value-added agricultural products and processes. Now, next month, Fields of Innovation is headed back into the field to take part in the Forever Green Oilseeds Field Day, which will be hosted by our partners at the University of Minnesota. The event will take place at the AURI Co-Products Utilization Lab in Waseca, Minnesota on Thursday, September 30th, and will feature updates on work that's being done in Minnesota to build sustainable supply chains for promising winter annual oilseed crops, including pennycress and winter camelina. For more details about this and other AURI Connect's Fields of Innovation events, you can visit our Fields of Innovation Facebook group, or you can go to auri.org. And of course, we always welcome your feedback on our programs, so please respond when we send you an evaluation. Thank you for participating today, and remember to visit the Fields of Innovation Facebook page for more information on Fields of Innovation or any of the work at AURI. Go to auri.org.